You turn in your Bibles to Psalm 4. Psalm 4, the fourth Psalm. We'll see how far we get. We may, like I say, I really, my intent is just to cover one a week. But if we cover two, that's all right. But 5 has so much in it that I don't want to, and yet I don't want to leave you hanging on 5. So we'll see. We'll shoot to just doing 4 tonight. I hope, and really, you might say, why study Psalm? Well, like I said, we're only going to study it for 13 weeks, and we'll move on because there's so many things that are so repetitive in it. It is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book of the Bible. It's a collection of psalms that were written over a period of many years. Some say as many as 150 years. I don't know if it was necessarily that long, but yet that's what some have said. Because how do we know? Some of them we don't know who wrote. But nevertheless, we go all the way from Moses at least to David, right? So long period of time. But they are a collection of writings that really in many ways are meant to inspire. And yet there are things about them that are disturbing. There are things about them that are challenging. There are things that are about them that are just from a standpoint of poetry, just beautiful to look at and to listen to. The psalmist spends a great deal of his time is in this section talking about the security of God, the help of God, the providence of God, the power of God, the strength of God. Many of them center, of course, upon God. The one tonight centers upon the security that God gives us. But I also, part of the reason why I wanted to study, at least, like I said, when we began this study for 13 weeks, and then we'll come back to it in a year or so. We'll come back and pick up from where we left off and do more, is to get you familiar and to get you to stop and see. We often, if you're like me, let me put it like that. If you're like me, you read the Psalms and you read one and you say, that's pretty, but I don't get it. But we don't stop and analyze a Psalm like we do, say, Genesis or Matthew. And yet we really should. There's so much in them and so much thought that's put within them that it really, they are stirring. And yet you see them and read them, so often. There was a fella many years ago that when asked how many books of the Bible, he said, well, there's 66. Well, good. And so he said, there's 9 in the Old Testament and there's 28 in the New Testament. I said, huh? And he says, yeah, and he carried me through Matthew, through Revelation, and Psalm. And I said, no, they just put it at the end of a lot of New Testaments, and that's what he was going by. He had a New Testament, and it was New Testament and Psalm, so therefore, no, it's just an addition there to help you, kind of give you some peace and some comfort, and these do. This Psalm, while it talks about security that's found in God, this Psalm is about trusting in the Lord. Let's look at what he says. He talks about, first of all, in verse 1, he talks about a plea. Now, you might have a superscription. Remember, we said last week superscriptions were not they were not inspired. They were finished. We don't really know when they were added. They were finished, though, by the time the Septuagint came around. The Greek translation of the New Testament came around, which was 150 BC. They were there then because they are included in the Septuagint, and so somewhere before then they were added. They do add a sense of helpfulness when they're there. It kind of gives us some insight, although really we don't have much insight into this psalm by the superscription. Notice what it says. It says, to the chief musician with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. Well, thank you a lot. It doesn't help me a lot. And when you look at it, and so we just look at it from the standpoint of maybe a song that was sung. A song that was chanted would be really more of the thought there because of that time. But you think you to think about maybe a time in your life, maybe done by individuals. And the psalm. There was a man one time that he that congregation had a lady that she would and she went up to him one evening and his car after work had broken down in front of a beer joint. And he had left it there for the evening, and late in the evening, one of his friends came and was able to tow it to a place to get it fixed. And so then the next Sunday at church, she came up to him and she said, "What was your truck doing in front of a beer joint?" And she didn't let him answer. She said, "It shouldn't have been there. People will talk." And he said, "Well, is that right?" And she said, "Yes." And she turned around and walked off. The next night, he went and parked his car in front of her house. She was an old widow woman. And he parked his car or his truck in front of her house and left it for the night. Got to be careful. There are times, though, when people do talk about times in which people do kind of besmirch us. And I think to a degree, when I look at Psalm 4, that's what I think about. This was, it will take reference, especially in verse 8, that this was probably a psalm that could be uttered at night before you go to sleep, when you lay your head down, but you're fixing to go to sleep. And so notice what he says. First of all, there's a plea. And there's three points to be made, if you will, about this plea. But notice what he says in verse 1. Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You've relieved me in my distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. Now think about what he says. He says, hear me when I call. Second of all, he says, have mercy upon me. And thirdly, he says, again, hear, but hear my prayer. 2:15 in our book. That's right. This is a song. I forgot about that. That's right. That's right. Hear me when I call, oh God. That's exactly right. Thank you. Forgot about that. Look at the look at the question. Look at what he's saying. Look at the statement. Hear me. Listen to me. Give heed to what I have to say. And then he refers to God, oh God, my righteousness, of my righteousness. Think about of my righteousness. Now, our righteous Savior came to this world and died so that when I become a child of God, I am made righteous and are then to live a righteous life. Let's think about that for a minute. Look, hold your finger there and look in Romans chapter 5. This is something that I had been thinking about with regards to righteousness for a couple of weeks before I started thinking about this psalm. But in chapter 5 and verse 19, Paul makes the statement, for as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience many will be made righteous. Now, I'm going to ask you to go back and study the context. But Paul is saying that when you become a child of God, you're made righteous. That righteousness then is to be lived. Since we're in Romans, look in Romans chapter 3, verse 25. Whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood, talking about Christ, through faith to demonstrate his righteousness. Because of his forbearance, God has passed over the sins that were previously committed. Now, I know your translation has the capital H there, and it's talking about the righteousness of the Lord. Okay, well, I would contend that maybe not, that's, of course, a translator's idea. But to prove my point of what I'm saying, look in 1 John chapter 3, verse 7. Little children, let no one deceive you. This is 1 John chapter 3, verse 7. He who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. So when we become a child of God, we are made the righteous children of God. And being the righteous children of God, then we practice righteousness. And so when the psalmist, now you can go back to Psalm 4. So when the psalmist says, "O God of my righteousness," he's not being ugly. He's not stating something that is not true. He's stating a fact. You're my God as I practice righteousness. You've relieved me in my distress. The idea of relieve, the Hebrew word is interesting. It's the idea of bringing into a large place so as to remove the distress as he talks about it. Notice, and there's a play on words here. You have relieved me. It's the idea of bringing into a large place. In my distress is the idea of a small, confined place. You've brought me into a wide space to relieve me of a narrow space. So in other words, he's just talking about, I'm going through a difficult time, and you've brought me to a safe place. You've brought me to a good place. Have mercy. Be gracious to me. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. Listen to what I'm saying. When I was at Waverly, our preacher, Lee, I was the associate minister, and Lee Brown was the preacher. And Lee would conclude his prayers with the plea, "Hear us, O God, we pray." I thought it was redundant. I still think it's redundant, but yet I also think that at the same time, too, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a simple plea, Lord, hear our prayer. Well, this is what the psalmist says. Have mercy upon me. Hear my prayer. Hear what I'm saying. Something somebody likes to say. Yes. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. That was so wrong of me, and I apologize. I think that he was asking for an answer, but in order for God to answer him, he had to get God's ear. And so I think when the psalmist, and this is not the only time that he pleads for God to hear him, when he's pleading for God to hear him, it may be a lack of confidence on his part. God will hear him. It may be just simply put that he's trying to get the ear of God, which is kind of unnecessary. Why would I say that? That's right. That's right. You don't have to do it. Oh, this might not be the right terminology, but I'm going to use it. You don't have to do a tap dance on top of the car in order to get God's attention. Now, that may be strange terminology, but you understand what I'm saying. You don't have to dance a jig. The very first congregation I ever worked for, this lady has now passed away a long time ago, but she could not get over the fact that some preacher, I think, had made an ill-advised statement somewhere along the line. And she really believed, because of what that preacher said, she really believed that there was a certain number, a quantity of prayers that had to be said for anything before God would hear it and God would answer it. I don't read that in the Bible. The effective, fervent prayer, singular, of a righteous man avails much. James 5. Enough said. But she dealt with that for the 2.5 years I was there. She struggled with that mightily. God hears our prayers. So I think he is trying to get the ear of God, but he's wanting, especially as we keep reading the psalm, a solution or an answer to his prayer. Yeah. Yeah. And the NIV says that, and I think the ASV says that. Go ahead. Your says answer to, yeah. Okay, so the ESV, and I'm thinking the ASV says it too. Yeah, 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 yeah. Uh, yeah, I'm reminded of a lady that used to tell me she'd talk to her husband, he'd start trying to fix it, and she would say, "I just need you to hear me. I don't need an answer." And she probably didn't knowing her, but yeah, yeah, good point. Good point. Anything else? Okay. Well, verses 2 and 3. I like what Eddie Clover said in his commentary. He calls this meditating out loud. I don't know necessarily that it is. It could be, I think, part of the prayer, and thus it could be out loud or even in the mind. But he says, "How long, O you sons of men?" Now, more than likely, he's talking about those that have gone against him now, his enemies. "Will you turn my glory to shame?" They've belittled him. They've belittled his integrity. They've talked about him. They've talked about his reputation. They've ruined his reputation. Now Solomon says in Proverbs 20, oh shoot, I meant to look it up. Proverbs 20, is it 22? A good name? Yeah, Proverbs 22, a good name is rather to be had than great riches. Make sure of that. Yes, good name is chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold. Good names. You want a good name. It's important that we keep a good name. And so the psalmist asks, "How long, O you sons of men?" And it's almost as if, at least right here, now I think this is a prayer to God, but it's almost as if right here he's talking to men, to those that have besmirched his good name. But yet at the same time too, it reminds us of this. And this is, I realize prayer is important. We have stressed reverence in our prayers, and we should. We are, after all, we are going before the very throne of God, discussing, if you will, telling him what we need and what we deserve. So, yes, God should be treated with the utmost of respect and the utmost of reverence. But at the same time, too, we thank you, Jim. We need to remember that we beseech God, when we ask God for these things, that we can talk to God and we can talk to Him about. Hmm, nobody's there. We can talk to Him even in the friendliest of terms. And so He's addressing his issue, but he comes at it a little bit maybe differently because he's now talking seemingly about or to these men, but he's still talking, I think, to God. He says, "How long will you love worthlessness?" Well, there's a call here that is a question, really, I think, to God. How long? How long will you love worthlessness? How long? The word love there is the idea of admire. How long do you admire? And the word worthless is the idea of empty or vain. How long are you going to admire the empty and the vain person and what they say? Their empty and vain words. And seek falsehood. Selah. Now, Selah, we talked about last week. That's a rest. You know, in music we have rest, musical rest, but here it's thought it could be a musical rest or a rest in the chant, but it's also the idea of, think about that for a minute. Consider that. But know that the Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly. The Lord will hear when I call to him. But know that the Lord has set apart. The Lord has, it's kind of interesting because the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Latin Vulgate have the idea of, but know that the Lord has made wonderful for himself those who are godly. The Lord will hear when I call. The word hear is interesting in the Hebrew. We think about people hearing, and sometimes people hear things that as they hear it and as they are listening to it, we realize that there's no relationship. I took Suzanne out for lunch. She was off today and took her out for lunch for Valentine's Day. And so I listened, listening is terrible. I heard the table next to us. There were two young couples, and one of them had a little girl, probably about 4, no older than 4, with them. And I heard a lot of their conversation. Didn't hear everything. Didn't try to hear it. Didn't want to hear it. It's just that the tables were close, and Suzanne wasn't talking to me, and I could hear what they were saying, what they were talking about. Well, there was no relationship there. We were not trying to figure out things. I was not trying to help them. I was not trying to minister to them. I wasn't trying to be involved with them or anything with regards to that. It was just a conversation that they were having that I overheard. This word here, heard, does not imply that. Now, you and I tonight have this type of relationship, a covenant relationship, wherein you have come with the idea of participating, and I hope you will, and you have, and that's wonderful, but the idea of hearing what I'm saying. And so there's an agreement, if you will, unwritten and unsaid, unspoken, but there's an agreement wherein there is going to be a dialogue between me and you, me. And so there is a relationship there between us. Well, that's the idea. When he says, Lord, will you hear when I call? It's the idea of there's a covenant between us, and there's a loyalty to that covenant that you need to keep up. I don't think, and I realize that I'm sort of giving David here a little bit of my own thinking, and I can't prove either way. But I don't think that he's saying God is not trustworthy. He's just calling upon God, basically, remember who I am. I'm your child. Remember what he said in verse 1, O God of my righteousness. Remember our relationship. You've listened to the vain people, the foolish people, the people that have really gone out against me. Now listen to me, your child. So the idea of, as Clover says, meditating out loud. Anything on those two verses? Well, verse 4 reminds us of Ephesians 4, right? Be angry and do not sin. The psalmist here is talking about a prayer really for his enemies. Be angry and do not sin. Meditate within your heart on your bed. Speak to your heart. The idea of meditate, we think of talking. Some versions may have the idea of murmuring or groaning. Meditating, we looked at it when we looked at Psalm 1. The idea of meditating, we think about of sitting down and pondering and giving thought to and thinking about and trying to figure out all the angles and the ifs and the ands and making it like when you meditate upon the Word of God, thinking about it, how does it apply to me? How can I live my life according to this? So forth, so on. But the idea of meditating in Old Testament times was the idea that you would sit there and you would groan as you would go through this thought process. And so sometimes versions will have meditate and sometimes they'll have groaning. The King James stays pretty close to the idea of meditating. Meditate. Speak to your own heart, within your heart, on your bed, and be still. Slow down and consider your ways. So here's for his enemies. Stop and think about what you're doing. Stop and think about what's happening. You can be angry, but don't sin in your anger. Don't sin in the anger that you have. Be careful with your anger, of course, but don't sin in it. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. So he's asking, have you thought about repenting? Thought about changing what you're doing? The direction you're going? All sacrifices of righteousness. Put your faith in the Lord. And he says, as he closes it out, he says, there are many who say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. You see, there's some that are going to say, what good are you doing? And especially those that would be enemies of David, they're going to ask the question, what are you doing and why are you doing this? Why do you talk to God? Why do you spend time with God? Why are you so concerned about God? What's this about God? Why are you worshiping God? These questions. And the questions that belittle. Your God can't do anything. Your God's really of no value. He's worthless. And he says, there are many that will say these things. Who will show us any good? But then he says, Lord, you show them. You lift your countenance upon them. It's kind of interesting because in this psalm, and this psalm is also very much connected with the one we studied last week, Psalm 3. But there's also in Psalm 4 where the psalmist is going to talk about his enemy, and he is going to for lack of a better term, he's going to ask God to take care of them. And we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about how that is found in many places in the Psalms in a minute. But he says, Lord, show them. You have gladness in my heart more than in the season that their grain and wine increased. Lord, you've put gladness in my heart. You've put joy in my heart. There is a discussion that I was reading this morning in preparation for this that I thought was very good. It was a discussion between the idea of happiness and joy. And from a biblical standpoint, from the standpoint of the Hebrew terms that are used, there's a difference between happiness and joy. Happiness is the idea of being happy, but happiness fades. Joy, especially as the Bible presents it, is that which is from beginning to end, from, if you will, all the time, 24 hours, never fades, always there. But it's a result of being in a relationship with God wherein the peace, the grace, the mercy, the contentment of God, and the graciousness of God, yeah, there's the word I'm looking for, abides in our life. And so because that abides in our life, then there's that joy, that constant joy that we have as children of God. Now, that doesn't mean, and this discussion didn't get into all this, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be times of sadness and sorrow and heartache and hurt. We covered a little bit of that Sunday morning. We talked about God sees our tears, God hears our cries, and he remembers them. But at this point, he's asking, he says, you've put gladness in my heart. And the harvest time would be for any farmer the greatest of times. Why? Because what he's put in to it, he now gets to receive it. He gets it out, right? Plus the fact that now at the harvest, there's great joy because not only is he seeing the fruits of his labor, but he's also realized that he's made it through all the storms and all the pestilence and all the possibilities of things that might ruin his crop. And he's able to see now that I've made it. And so he rejoices. Well, when would be harvest time? Well, he lists two. Harvest for grain and harvest when the grapes come in. When the harvest time comes, it's the happiest time. But you've made my heart more joyful or happy than at those seasons of the year. And so he says, verse 8, I will both lie down in peace and sleep. There's the idea of complete and total serenity. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. You, Lord, make me dwell in safety. Not the people that are talking about me, not those that are saying things about me, but you, Lord, you make me to dwell in safety. And so it's a psalm of security. I'm secure in God for the things that he has done and the things that he's doing. Is there something somebody like say, we want to talk about what can we learn, lessons we can learn, but anything anybody wants to say or ask thus far? Right. Very true. That's right. That's right. Yeah. I guess where I was amused in this discussion was I was looking at it from the Old Testament words as opposed to New Testament. That's a good point. It's an excellent point. Anything else? I'd always studied probably the New Testament, and I probably had studied it in the Old Testament, but had forgotten it. You ever forget anything? Do you remember when you made that last statement? We all do. We all do, don't we? Well, let's learn some lessons. What are the gifts? If you think about this whole psalm, not just one part of it, but you think about this whole psalm. Here, in looking back at it, the gifts come because we trust in God. Verse 1, deliverance. Deliverance from the distress that's going on. The second gift is the confidence that one's prayer will be heard. Say, beseeches the Lord to hear him. I think pretty much as Jay says, when you get down to the end, there's the confidence God will. Thirdly, there's the gracious favor of God. Verse 3, he talks about how that you've set me in a wonderful place. Lord will hear when I call on him. Fourthly, there's the joy that you cannot buy. Verse 7, you cannot buy that joy. It's given to you as a child of God. There are those, and let me say this, there are those individuals that the guilt in their life, they have difficulty removing the guilt, and that joy is difficult for them to comprehend. No matter what age we are, and no matter how long we've been a Christian, the idea of working on ourselves should always be there, no matter where we are in life. You know, I've run into people, not everybody, but I've run into some that once they hit the retirement age and they retire, it's the idea they retire from everything, which is a mistake. And there's a lot of folks that I've talked with, counseled with, worked with that believe, we can retire from church work and we can retire from individual growth. And that's not true. When when a tree quits adding rings, when it's dead. Until you die, keep going, keep pushing. And so there's a growth that happens. So as the psalmist talks here, there's joy that you cannot buy, but there's a peace, and we've already talked about that there's a peace that comes. Verse 7, when you trust in God. Then ultimately, verse 8, there's a security that we talked about. Here's another lesson that we might learn. And that's the idea of praying for our enemies. Well, that's difficult, isn't it? There's probably someone in your past that has said something, done something, taken something from you. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. I really am. I've been through it too. I understand. The best way that we can begin to forgive them, as we said a couple of Sunday nights ago, is to forgive them. Well, it'll be one Sunday night ago to this coming Sunday, but is to pray for them. Psalmist here, David prays for his enemies. That takes a lot. That takes a lot of dealing with a lot of emotions. Because when people hurt you and they hurt you deeply, now some will do it unintentionally, but there are those that do it intentionally. Now, they do it maybe because they think they are right, and they do it because maybe they think not only are they right, but you're wrong. But they become those individuals that ultimately we would categorize in our vernacular as enemies. And I think we learned the great lesson from David. Pray for him. Pray for him. Like I say, it may take a lot. I'll tell you it will. But you pray for them, and you basically you end up making them those that aren't your enemies. But then thirdly, I think a lesson that we can truly, and we've already kind of looked at it, learn is that true safety is found in God. True safety. The safety that the psalmist had here was that he could carry his prayer to God, and God would hear him. That was the safety he felt, that he knew that he could approach God, and God would hear him, and God would consider his request. Now, there's the key. This is not so much mentioned in this psalm, but it is the key that we need to remember. That God hears and considers our request, but that does not mean that he will answer our request in the way we've asked it. Now, we do not know how this came out. We don't know how God answered this prayer because we don't know when it fits into David's life. And we really don't have a clue. There's no way to clue it in. But there's safety that's found in God. I like this. There's the fact that in our prayers we can make requests. Matter of fact, right at the beginning, verse 1, he makes 3 great requests. We can make requests in our prayers, but we can also plea in our prayers. Make pleas, not pleas. But then another lesson that we can learn is to be concerned with those who are out of harmony with God's purpose. And as we've already talked about, pray for our enemies. But there are those that are walking contrary to the will of God. Many of them are involved in our life. But we need to pray for them. We need to pray that they will get back in the straight and narrow, that they will listen to God and follow God and accept his will. Now, having said that, is there something you'd like to add? Something you learned? Okay, well, let's look at Psalm 5. We'll not get into it. I'm just going to give you some thoughts beforehand, and you can look at it. We will look at it next week. The psalmist is going to look at God as a place of refuge and a place of protection. The psalm itself is a psalm of guidance. He's looking to God for guidance, and he's asking for guidance. Now, here's something I want you to think about. As he talks about, jump down to verse 10. As he talks about evil men in this psalm, notice what he says: pronounce them guilty, O God. This is, and I'll talk about this more next week. This is what's called an imprecatory statement, which just simply means that he is calling upon God, let my enemies suffer. We probably all wanted to pray that. And we see a contrast in that statement and what the psalmist did in Psalm 4. But, and here's something for you to study if you've got time and you've got a few Bible books. The idea, or get it on a computer, the idea of an imprecatory, imprecatory, imprecatory prayer is found several places in the Psalms. Now, we're not going to be studying them this time, but kind of look at them and see what you think about them and see what you feel about them, and think about how in the world can a child of God who's supposed to love, supposed to forgive, ask God to take care of his enemies. Now, I'm going to give you my answer, and you can give me yours. I hope you will. But I'll give you my answer, my thought next week on that. But just think about that as you look at that, because it's just kind of an interesting thought. And that way, when I hit you with it next week, you won't say, well, I've never thought of that, or I've never considered it in my studies. Anything else? Well, from a standpoint of pronouncing them guilty and asking God basically, send lightning down and strike them and stone them or whatever, send judgment upon them, maybe that's the question. How can a man do that? Psalmist did it here. But that's to be honest, that's not a real good answer. There is a truth to it. There is a truth to it because there is a contrast between the old and new, and we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. But we have to go further than just say, well, it's the Old Testament. Yeah. Well, we sacrifice. Hebrews 13 talks about modern day sacrifices. By him, therefore, let us offer up the sacrifice of praise to God continually. Hebrews 13:17. Romans 12, that we give our bodies as living sacrifices. So there's sacrifices in the New Testament. Do what now? There is a difference between animal sacrifice and us, yes. Yeah. That's a good point. It's a good point. Excellent point. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Anything else? That was good. All right. Well, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day. We're thankful for the blessings that you've given to us, and we're thankful for the fact that you love us and watch over us. We ask that you be with us, that we'll be better Christians and better examples before others, that we will learn from this song, that we will learn the importance of of talking to you and pleading to you and understanding that you will hear and you will listen and consider what we bring before your very throne. We ask that you be with those that were mentioned as sick earlier. We ask that you'll watch over them, that you'll bless them. We also ask that you be with those that were not announced, that we know of, that are going through some difficult times physically. We ask that you restore them back to their much normal walks of life, if it be your will. We ask that you be with us now, bless us and keep us and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Excuse me. Y'all have a great week.